Welcome to Savage Minds. I'm your host, Julian Vigo. Today's guest is Vladimir Bortun, a lecturer at the University of Oxford and a critical political scientist whose research interests fall into three areas: transnational cooperation of the radical left during the Eurozone, to include the conceptualization of a new type of Euroscepticism and of a new subfamily of parties; the processes of political resocialization that migrants go through, with a focus on return migrants who become politicians in their country of origin, wherein he challenges the normative assumptions underlying the theoretical nexus between migration and democratization; and the impact of politicians' class background on their political outlook and behavior. Currently, he is developing a research agenda around the class politics of right-wing populist parties, hoping to instigate a materialist turn in the study of populism. Vladimir is the author of Crisis, Austerity, and Transnational Party Cooperation in Southern Europe, The Radical Left's Lost Decade, among numerous other publications. I welcome Vladimir Bortun to Savage Minds. I wanted to ask if we could start off by talking about the weaknesses of the European left and what I call the left in air quotes. I put it in quotes because a lot of neoliberals think that they're leftists, but they're not, okay? And you've seen this too, where they sort of try to piggyback onto leftist rhetoric, but at the end of the day, they're very different. I'd like to talk about the crisis of fragmentation in your work, where you describe the creation of the European Left Alliance, for instance, as adding to a chronic problem of fragmentation. Does this split represent a genuine ideological divorce between old and modern leftists? Or is it merely a symptom of personal and national tactical disagreements that, as I just mentioned, form part and parcel of this neoliberal grouping, which is quite large as well?
Yeah, that's a great way to start our conversation. And thank you again for inviting me to your podcast. I would say there is a broader historical process at play within which these processes are embedded. And we have seen during the last 45, 50 years of neoliberal hegemony, we have seen a wholesale shift to the right of the whole political spectrum, not just of the right itself, which has become more and more radical on both economic and let's call them cultural issues, although I think it's hard to demarcate a clear distinction between the two. They are often intertwined with each other, and maybe we can touch upon that at some point as well. But the left itself has moved to the right, particularly on economic issues. The social democracy, as we know, with Tony Blair in Britain and Bill Clinton in the United States, and even before them, arguably, the first social democrat to capitulate to neoliberal dogmas was François Mitterrand in France in the early 80s, who won the presidential elections on the basis of a pretty strong left reformist program, not a full-fledged socialist program, but it had some radical elements, including some limited nationalization of big companies, and ended up implementing the opposite and opening the way to the neoliberalization of European social democracy. Then in Germany, we know we had Gerhard Schröder during his time as prime minister, the SPD, which has a long history of betrayals of the working class, implemented neoliberal measures that undermined workers' collective bargaining and the rise in wages to boost German capitalism and particularly its trade, its external, its export industries. So this is pretty much it's pretty widely accepted that social democracy has moved to the right. in internalizing many of the dogmas of neoliberal hegemony. But we often underestimate the extent to which the radical left as well has moved to the right during this period. And it has become de facto the new social democracy. The radical left in Europe today, by and large, is limited to defending the policies and values abandoned by social democracy. That's why in my work I call it the neo-reformist left, because it is not a radical left that aims to overcome capitalism, which is what it means etymologically and historically to be radical left, to aim for systemic change, right, from the root, change society from the root, not just trim the branches. But it aims to recover post-war Keynesian agenda, plus some of the new left topics on environment, on gender equality, and so on, which is hence the prefix neo. Like neoliberalism now was in itself an attempt to recover classical liberalism. This neo-reformism is an attempt to recover post-war Keynesian social democracy, which means that the parties like Syriza in Greece, people might not remember them, but they were seen as this radical left party in government about 10 years ago when they won the elections. And other parties of their ilk, when they get into some level of power, because of their reformist outlook, because of their reformist program, they have a reformist strategy, and they think they can win policies through the institutions of capitalist democracy, of neoliberal democracy. And they often hit a wall because they don't have a truly radical approach to politics. That would mean a radical program, a radical strategy, radical tactics, radical way of organizing on the streets and in the institutions, So this is also reflected at the European level, which means that the radical left, which historically was opposed to European integration, because the European integration from the very beginning, not some point in its evolution became neoliberal. From the very beginning, it was a proto-neoliberal project. It's for fundamental freedoms, the freedom of movement for capital, goods, services, and labor is an anticipation of the neoliberal mantras that would arrive a few decades after the establishment of the European Community in the early 1950s. So from the very beginning, it was a project aimed to restore or boost the profitability of big business in Northwestern Europe from the very beginning, and it has been like that ever since. Every leap in European integration, whether we talk about the single market established in the mid-80s, whether we talk about the introduction of the euro, like you mentioned, the economic monetary union established in 92 with the Treaty of Maastricht, and then in the introduction of the euro itself as a currency in 99, all these leaps in integration have only consolidated this institutional architecture that overwhelmingly benefits capital over labor and core countries in Europe over peripheral countries in Southern Europe or Eastern Europe, right? It's all these founding members like the Netherlands, Belgium, but particularly Germany, of course, and other powerful northern economies like Sweden, who overwhelmingly and structurally benefit from this institutional design. And the radical left, instead of calling this out, has for decades now deluded itself that it can reform this neoliberal, neocolonial, undemocratic project into a progressive leftist direction. And it has failed time and time again. If anything, the European Union has become all the more neoliberal and undemocratic and neocolonial and so on. And to finish on this point, my answer to your question is very interesting. What you mentioned at the beginning, that you were in London at the time and many neoliberal leftists were defending the EU on the basis of their identity as Europeans. And I've been living in England for 12 years, almost 13 years now, and there is a type of, and admirable otherwise, a type of English person or British person who wants to run away so badly from the Little Englander mentality, the parochial, the kind of nationalist, jingoist type of Englishman, that they end up in a very superficial kind of internationalist identity, and for them being part of the European Union was a crystallization of that identity. It was something that they could point to. But if they would be true internationalists, they would be the biggest critics of the European Union, because the European Union has constantly, throughout its history, acted in neo-colonial ways that undermine internationalism in its basic principles. So, yeah, I think the radical left has abandoned, this outlook on politics that requires us to approach the problem from the root rather than just to try and, as I said before, trim its branches.
We see this kind of Sturm und Drang, if I can use that term here, the stress and pull, I guess, between Marxists and socialists, or the way that many were disappointed by Bernie Sanders, but I could see that coming a mile away. How can I put it gently? I don't hold out a lot of hope for Mamdani. I think a lot of what passes for socialism in the US is this kind of idealist soapbox speak that quickly evaporates. And I'm not going to blame the system for this either, because there is a movement of people, especially since lockdown, even in Canada, who really want an end to certain things. Identity politics, they want there to be a focus on workers' rights. So we've got this notion of social mobilization in the US historically that's been shattered, in my opinion. I don't think Americans really buy the you can be born poor and rise into wealth, especially given the recent report that just came out regarding the rise of billionaires that just surpassed 3,000, and then the long-term work of economists on the left who discuss the rentier class. I think what's happening in the States is people are beginning, finally, to have class consciousness. But the problem is that it's not always translated through class. It becomes very much about individualism or identity. So this is the stress between those on the left and those on the neoliberal. I don't think neoliberals are very left at all, to be quite honest, but whatever. Mm. And then the strange thing that's happened, and we saw it with the assassination of Charlie Kirk, but you've got people on the right who sound more leftist than some of the people calling themselves leftists, which I find fascinating. And then in your work on leftist parties here in the EU, you have argued that many leftist parties have traded social mobilization for what you call a narrow understanding of politics centered on parliament. Mm. Is it possible, therefore, for a party to maintain its radical edge while operating within the constraints of liberal democratic institutions, or is institutionalization an inevitable trap?
I don't think it's inevitable. I think it's important for radical parties to operate within the institutional framework of capitalism, because it gives visibility. If we stay in our corner, we will not ever reach the masses of people. But I think also it's important to prove in practice the limits of capitalist democracy. Because let's be honest, you can only, the institutions of capitalist democracy, parliament, the courts of law and so on, they have been designed from the very beginning to serve the reproduction of capitalist order, right? And to protect the interests of the capitalist state and the capitalist class it fundamentally represents. So whenever in history, let's say a left government tried to overreach and do more than it was allowed within that framework, the capitalist state was quickly mobilized to crush that government. Whether it was done in through the judicial system, right, where the Supreme Court or the Constitutional Court of a country would stop a government from implementing progressive policy. Quick example, random example, when I was living in Barcelona a few years ago, the Catalan government decided to impose rent control in Barcelona because the rents are going through the roof. And the Constitutional Court banned that piece of legislation because it was undermining private property rights. So a very concrete, small example of how the whole capitalist state can be mobilized against the more democratic institutions of the capitalist state, where we have some influence through the electoral process to crush any kind of project of social change. And if that doesn't work, capitalism always has in its repertoire of tactics all kinds of instruments, violent instruments of repression to crush any government that goes too far in its reformist objectives. So we have to bear this in mind constantly, that we will not achieve the kind of systemic change that we need for a million of reasons. We need systemic change in the world that we live today. That will not happen through the framework of the system that we are trying to overthrow. However, this is an abstract idea. It's an abstract argument. We won't convince the masses of people that we need a revolution now and we cannot do anything. We cannot really achieve systemic long-term change through the institutions of liberal democracy. This has to be proven in practice, I think. The limits of democracy as it exists today in capitalist societies have to be proven in practice. That's why we need to engage with these institutions. We need to run in elections, local elections, general elections, and win office if we can, but only to use that office to prove in practice the limits of being in office, and always lean back on the street and the power emanating from the street and from the workplaces where we organize, the schools and universities where we organize, the local communities and neighborhoods where we organize. That's the real power that we really have as a radical left. And we see today, even in the United States now, who is leading the opposition to this domestic terrorist state, the domestic, basically, state terrorism that we see in the United States with ICE agents just killing people randomly on the streets. Who is leading the fight against that? It's not the Democrats in Congress, right? It's not the elected. It's the people on the streets. It's the popular classes that are self-organizing and are going in the coldest winter days of the year to oppose armed domestic terrorists, state-sponsored domestic terrorism, basically. So I think we need to approach the question of political and social change from this dual perspective. We need to engage with these institutions. We can't stay isolated from them, because otherwise we will not have a mass audience and any kind of visibility. But always keeping in mind that those institutions were put there in place for a reason, to serve certain social groups with certain interests. And it's not us. It's not our interests that capitalist democracy is supposed to defend.
I worry that, talk about the far-right threat here, and even the way that Brexit was posited as a far-right threat, and where you saw this in the election run up to Trump as well. He represents populism. Hold on. Populism has been a thing even on the left. And why is populism bad exactly? This idea that there's the working class, and when they're angry and perceived as on the right, that's bad. But when they're angry and perceived as on the left, like Antifa in the States, that's good. I'm just thinking through this because in Europe, as you know, there is, in some places, a real threat of a far right. In other places, the rhetoric is greater than the reality, if you know what I mean. And then in places like the UK, it's interesting. You've got Tommy Robinson, Farage, of course. Robinson has said things that aren't exactly, how to put it, he's thinking about working class future. And I'm not saying that he's a leftist in any sense, but there is an overlap between some of the concerns on the left and the right. And so I do wonder if painting every single person who's worried about immigration, as you know, something that Karl Marx had a lot to say about as well. He warned about immigration being used by the bourgeoisie as a means of pushing down wages and as a means of controlling laborers. So what do you think about this kind of threat from the far right, allegedly? And why is the populist far right currently more successful than the radical left at capturing working class anger, even though, as you note yourself, the far right does not actually challenge the economic status quo overall?
It is incredible that all those famous checks and balances of US democracy are failing to operate, right? We've been told for so many years that US democracy may not be perfect, but it has this sophisticated system of checks and balances where if one institution goes too far, then the other institutions will step in to keep it in check. Well, this is not happening. It's not happening. The Congress, the Supreme Court, the Constitution, all this, again, to point to the true nature of capitalist democracy, which is about who holds power. It's not about at the end of the day, all these principles and rules and laws and institutions that are supposed to protect democracy and human rights and individual freedoms, like you also mentioned during the post 9/11 environment, they didn't matter, they didn't count, they did it their own way at the end of the day. And I think it's important to emphasize this continuity between post 9/11 and what the Bush years and then the Obama years, because you are right, we should absolutely denounce any attempt to even Bush being somehow recovered from the liberal left as a decent, reasonable politician compared to Trump. But Obama, Bush, all these people, they killed hundreds of thousands of people abroad. The drone program started under Obama. The mass deportations started under Obama. No, I think under Obama more people were deported from the US than under Trump's first mandate. So Trump may be an acceleration and a radicalization of features that and policies and processes that had been under play for many years, that the US government and the US imperialism abroad has been doing for decades. Like what happened in Venezuela with the capture of Maduro. How many times did the United States do in its history similar things or worse? It's not an exception, it's not an aberration. It's a logical consequence of the current stage of US imperialism. So it's that I agree with this problem of, and then I'll get on the final part of your comment about the far right and the populist right. But I think it's a danger in overemphasizing the persona of Donald Trump. Like you mentioned, the Trump deranged syndrome. I think we should stop talking about Trump and talk about Trumpism, which is not the same as Trump. You can't reduce Trumpism to the man himself, and which is a form of Bonapartism, to talk in Marxist terms. That is very characteristic of the crisis in which US capitalism and US imperialism is finding itself. And we see here clearly the driving forces of Trumpism, not the people who vote for Trump. Again, let's discard this electoralist illusion that politics is about who votes for whom and why. That's only part of the ritual every 4 years, right? The real interests that are at play, the driving forces behind Trump's project, those sections of the capitalist class that are shaping Trump's policy agenda and are looking to benefit from it, particularly this new faction of the military-industrial complex, the tech faction, the Palantirs of this world, who are driving these far-right projects, not just in the US, also the fossil fuel industry that is funding a lot of the far-right parties in North America and Europe. In the case of Reform UK, more than half of their donations come from extractive capital from fossil fuel industries. So, yes, of course, they exploit people's legitimate grievances about a number of issues. And I agree that, obviously, I wouldn't agree with how Tommy Robinson talks about immigration. And I would dispute his working class credentials. He's a middle class posh boy who was privately educated. His real name is Yaxley Lennon with a hyphen. So he comes from a privileged background who always tried to present himself as one of the lads, as a working class tough guy. Hence why he adopted the nickname Tommy Robinson, which was the name of a famous football hooligan from his local team, Luton Town.
I had heard as well that he was a bit of a posturati. It seems that he grew up in what is described as the Bedfordshire working class of the 80s and 90s. And he makes this claim of self-identification as being a working class man from Luton. Again, in this era of identity politics, it becomes a hard thing to argue either way at this point. But I see what you mean.
Yeah. And the thing with Robinson is that he uses legitimate grievances or questions about the impact of immigration on wages and workers' rights and collective bargaining, for example, and the fact that a lot of the precarious migrant labor is hard to unionize for a number of reasons. But he transforms this material issue in a cultural issue. He makes it all about culture, all about religion. He never talks about these things, the economic aspects of it. He never talks about the exploitation of workers. When British workers lose their jobs because some multinational corporation wants to move production to a cheaper country, Tommy Robinson and the people like him are nowhere to be seen. They are never on a picket line to support workers. They are never joining any campaign in defense of jobs and wages and workers' rights. Never. And that's because he fundamentally, and those like him, he's a good example of a broader category of far-right grifters and agitators and politicians. They promote very, very elite interests. I mean, he has been funded by the richest man in the world, by Elon Musk. In what universe can we see somebody who is supported by the richest man on the planet to be some kind of force for the working class, some force against the establishment? I think, on the other hand, that the left does not know how to counter this, not know how to counter this type of movements and rhetoric, because they focus on all these identity-related things, that he's an Islamophobe, that he's a racist, and he's all those things. And it's wrong. Those things are wrong. They are bad things to be. But Trump and Farage and all these people have been called these things for so many years now. And to what effect? Trump has been called a sexist and a racist from 10 years ago, right? In 2015, he launched his presidential bid. It was more than 10 years ago. And he was called all these things from day one. And it didn't stop him from winning. This didn't stop him from winning twice. And I think the left needs to shift the gaze and the debate not on this terrain of identity politics and cultural politics, which is what the far right wants to have the debate on, because they are winning the debate on these issues. We need to shift the debate towards material class-based issues, because this is where the far right has no solutions. And that's why they don't talk about these problems. They don't talk about economic issues. They don't talk about class issues, because fundamentally their policies on those issues, it doesn't mean that they don't have policies on those issues just because they don't talk about them. It means that their policies wouldn't be popular with the kind of masses that they are supported by. They would lose the support of the people they convinced if they would show their true colors when it comes to the economy and the kind of interests that they serve. So, after all, Trump lost the elections in 2020 because he had failed to deliver on the living standards of ordinary Americans. And of course, Harris lost because they failed as well to deliver on those living standards issues and the living cost crisis and so on. And at the end of the day, this is where people vote with their pockets. People vote with their pockets, and the left needs to recover that discourse that exposes far right for the privileged and elite agenda and interest that it serves. Always, just to finish on this long answer, always the far right, whether it was in its populist manifestations of today or in the fascist version of the last century, when they were trying to present themselves as socialists, right? The Nazis, they called themselves the National Socialist Party. Even the Italian fascists had some superficial anti-capitalist rhetoric. This was always before they came into power. Why? Because socialism was very popular at the time among the working class in Italy, in Germany. So they wanted to appeal to those people by pretending to be on their side, by pretending to be against big finance capital and so on. And this is what these far-right populists are doing today. They are presenting themselves as being on the side of the people to win their support. But in reality, when they come into power, just like the fascists, when they came into power in Italy and Germany, they represented the interests of big monopoly capital. This was their track record in government. They didn't support workers. On the contrary, workers in Germany lost virtually any independent organizations. They lost their rights to collective bargaining. Their wages increased at a much lower rate than the profits of big business did during the Nazi regime. So the imperialist war of aggression of Nazi Germany was again for the benefit of big monopoly capital, that for the German cartels, right, for which Germany had become too small. They needed to expand their markets and their supply chains and their access to natural resources. And this is what's happening today with these far-right populists. Whenever they get into power, and I think populism is not a good term. We can talk a lot about this. It's a term I tend to avoid, but because people are using it, I'm using it as well. Yeah. But when they get into government, whether it's Meloni in Italy where you live, or it's Trump, or whether it would be Farage in the UK, they never do anything substantial to improve ordinary people's lives. They always seek to strengthen the domination of big business. And in particular, to be more specific, to talk about the European context, it's domestic big business that felt squeezed by globalization, that felt squeezed by neoliberalism. In the case of Europe, by European integration. And it's these kind of domestic businesses who are trying now to defend themselves by putting in power nationalist parties that they can rely on. They can rely on a favorable policy from parties. In Hungary, we see this very clearly played out over the last decade or so with Orban in government. Orban basically he's the architect of an entirely new Hungarian capitalist class, of a new domestic bourgeoisie that was feeling marginalized by foreign big business that operate in Hungary. And this is the story across the region in Central and Eastern Europe, just to briefly mention that part of the world as well. So just to the bottom line is that these are people who maybe have economic power, but they don't feel politically empowered and use far-right projects as their political vehicles for their own representation, for their interests. But because they wouldn't be able to win power by themselves, they need to create a cross-class alliance that includes disaffected working-class voters who used to vote for the left back in the day, who include precarious petty bourgeois people, small business owners, farmers, and so on, which is, historically speaking, the social base of the far right, and include all these kind of class fractions in a project, in a broader project for hegemony, to capture state power, promising a little each of these components of their coalition, but fundamentally it's a coalition led by and for the benefit of these sections of the capitalist class.
Why has the left failed to articulate a class-based patriotism there that could compete with the far right's nationalist narratives that we saw, for instance, in the last election in Romania?
That's a very good question. The short answer is that because there's no left in Romania, not significant enough to be able to build a mass-based alternative to the populist far right. Why? Because the last 35 years of neoliberal capitalism have been so intense and so systematic that they eroded all the social foundations of the political left. They've eroded trade unions. They've imposed neoliberal legislation that makes it impossible, virtually impossible, for trade unions to organize in the private sector. They've created the economic conditions for the mass economic exodus of millions of Romanians. We have the highest emigration rate in whole of Europe. We're talking about 5 million people who left the country over the last 25 years, out of a population of 22 million at the time. So huge mass economic migration. We have one nominally left-wing party, the Social Democratic Party, which has been the main party of government since 1989, but which in reality is basically the political tool of a certain section of the national bourgeoisie that emerged after 89, and often emerged from sections of the former Communist Party's bureaucracy, who were in good positions to start accumulating capital in the early 90s and set up businesses, and then use PSD as their kind of political vehicle to give out state contracts, public contracts, and so on. So for a lot of people, the left in Romania is associated with this oligarchic, corrupt party that is the Social Democratic Party. There is an independent left that has inevitably emerged, because we know capitalism inevitably creates the conditions for anti-capitalism to develop. And a new independent left emerged in the last 10, 15 years, but it's still based on civil society kind of organizations, student groups, small radical left groups, socialist and communist groups, who haven't been able to coagulate in a big coherent movement. So basically we have a big vacuum on the left in Romania, which means exactly what you said, that the populist far right is able to capitalize on the very issues that the left would otherwise. So they managed to take this problem of Romania's subordination to foreign capital, to foreign powers, which is true, is real, which is why I said that the European Union is a neo-colonial project. And they managed to capitalize on these real problems to incorporate in their own political project the people who left Romania because of poverty, the people who feel exploited in their workplace and that nobody looks after them, who now are voting for the far right. But then again, to go back to my previous point, who are these people leading the far right in Romania? They are themselves business owners, construction company owners, retail business owners, the kind of domestic bourgeoisie that, like I said earlier, seeks some kind of state power to safeguard their interests from foreign corporations that are currently monopolizing vast sectors of the economy. Banking sector is overwhelmingly controlled by foreign banks. Energy sector overwhelmingly controlled by foreign companies. Manufacture industry overwhelmingly controlled by foreign businesses. So there are a few sections of the economy that are still let's say, to a large extent controlled by domestic businesses. And these are the businesses that are now trying to politically organize themselves and defend themselves from foreign businesses. And this is a clash, a contradiction that your usual liberal commentators will never talk about, because they are the ones who support, uncritically support, foreign direct investment, big businesses coming over to Romania to open shop and buy public assets for next to nothing. You know, I'm talking here about all the mass privatizations of state industries and natural resources and other public services in the 90s and 2000s. So the people who supported all these things cannot now really reframe the debate in these class terms and economic terms, because they would have to admit to their own mistakes. So they have to castigate the far-right populists as demagogues and racists and anti-European and Putin's puppets and all these things, instead of going to the core of the problem.
Wouldn't the left have better results even in bringing people from across the aisle over by speaking more clearly about class interests? This is the thing that I think they miss. That said, when I suggest this to fellow leftists, there's this whole underpinning, as you know, of historical gripes and the arguments that go on, and they get lost in what I call Peyton Place. I don't know if you've seen that film from the 50s, but it's like a telenovela of Marxism. And it's like, I don't want to get involved in arguing over the Frankfurt School or arguing over Stalin or the Holodomor. Can we just talk about this now? These groupings get bogged down by internecine fights.
Yeah.
It's fascinating to me, and yet it's depressing because today we need a kind of coherence. You also talk about the false dichotomy between grassroots organizing and parliamentary work. What does a successful synthesis of these two look like in practice? Because as we talk about organizing on the left, a lot of people seem to feel like there's no coherence between the two. If you could talk about maybe a specific party or movement that is getting this right?
Yeah, there are some positive examples. It's not all gloomy on the European left. And for example, one of the most significant electoral achievements of the European left in recent years was the new Popular Front in France in the elections from 24 now? In the summer of 24, you might remember the president of France, Macron, he instigated snap elections, legislative elections, because of the triumph of the far-right Rassemblement National, the National Rally, in the European elections that year. So he said, okay, we have to organize legislative election to give the French people the say. Do they want this party in government? And I guess it was a tactical gamble that he played that partly misfired. People at the time said that he did that because he wanted the National Rally, Le Pen's party, to win those legislative elections, be in government, prove that it's not capable to have any solutions to people's problems. So when the next presidential elections come, which I think they are in 2 years' time or something like that, they would lose their popular appeal. The far right would lose its credibility as a party capable to govern France. But most of the pollsters were saying that National Rally will win these elections, these legislative elections that Macron called. They were held in 2 rounds in the summer of 24, and the left, the main radical left party in France, La France Insoumise, which means the France unbowed France, if that's a correct translation, led by Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who is, I think, one of the better politicians of the European left that we've had in recent years. And they organized a broad coalition of left forces, which they led. They weren't junior partner to a liberal party like it happens in other countries with the left. They were the main force within this broader progressive coalition that they also included the Socialist Party, which, it's not a real socialist party, it's a centrist party, the Green Party and other forces. And they managed to they pulled out a big electoral surprise. They won the elections. In the second round, they won more seats than any other political force. But of course, what followed is that Macron would not, who is the president of the country and has the power to appoint the prime minister, did not appoint a prime minister from the left who had won the elections and was entitled to form government, but managed to bring together the mainstream right and the far right, the same far right that he wanted to expose. He worked with them in order to impose his own prime minister from a party that, Les Républicains, that only got 5%. Okay, this is the context. But how did the left achieve that electoral success in such a brief period of time? Not by going on fancy TV debates. They did that as well. But they did the groundwork. They went into the communities that no politician would go to. Yeah, the working class deprived areas outside of Paris, the famous banlieues. They went there, they knocked from door to door, and they talked to people about their grievances. Rather than going to people and just sharing leaflets to preach them about the danger of the racist National Rally coming to power, they actually engaged with people in their communities on their terms to find out what people wanted and what mattered to them the most and what were the most pressing issues for them. And this way they created a campaign, a grassroots campaign, in a relatively short period of time that saw them win the highest share of votes in working class neighborhoods that any left party in France had achieved in the previous two decades. So this is just a small example of how, if the left rediscovers its roots, it rediscovers its rebuilds its linkage to the popular classes, and it tries to occupy again the spaces where people live and work, go into their communities, go into their workplaces, go into their schools and universities, to rebuild this kind of nexus between class and party, which has eroded over the last 40, 50 years of neoliberalism. This is the way to move forward. And of course, they haven't been in government for the reasons I mentioned, because Macron constantly sabotaged them and superimposed his own preferred prime ministers. And I think they are on the third prime minister since those elections. But if the left comes into power in France or in other countries, in Belgium, for example, the Workers' Party is in a pretty good position there. They are a strong radical left party that is worth looking at by other people on the left in other countries. I think they are a very interesting party that are blending this parliamentary institutional work with grassroots work, and they have won some concrete policies in favor of rent control, in favor of workers' rights at local level, where they have some power at local level. It shows how the two strategies can be combined. And that doesn't, like you said, it's a false dichotomy. We either organize at the grassroots level in communities, or we run for elections to win state power or local council power. We have to do both, and we have to see them as two sides of the same coin. It's the only way the left can win.
You're listening to Savage Minds, and we hope you're enjoying the show. Please consider subscribing. We don't accept any money from corporate or commercial sponsors, and we depend upon listeners and readers just like you. Now, back to our show. What I'm seeing also here in Italy is that the fragmentation has been so vast. I'm thinking back to the years of D'Alema, that now what I'm seeing is a lot of people have been abandoning their leftist parties. People like Marco Rizzo, who used to be an MEP, he's speaking out vociferously against immigration in a way that might make you and I uncomfortable. At the same time, he also addresses workers' rights. It's a very strange mixture. What do you see happening with the left in Italy? Because also what's interesting in Italy that is hopeful are like the dock workers in Genoa. They give me hope.
Yeah.
Although the other political parties here, Ellie Schlein, she has all the talking points of a leftist, but not really. I tried to meet with her during the year after lockdown. I actually was writing a piece about why she and other politicians didn't try to stop these horrific lockdowns, which have caused endless problems of mental health for children, much less adults. She was silent on this. Her notion of working class issues resembles that of the Democrats in the US, not very leftist at all. Almost nothing is said. She spends far more time, however, talking about trans-identified people. So I'm thinking, oh no, we're back on this crazy hamster wheel where identity politics seems to actually trump the workings of class interests. And I get very frustrated by that because here in Italy, most people are fighting tooth and nail for their survival now, especially since lockdown.
No, I think personally, I support the trans rights, and I think they are one of the most oppressed categories of people in society. But when this becomes the main focus of a left party, it will inevitably alienate large sections of the population, not because large sections of the population hate trans people or are opposed to trans rights, but because for them other issues are bigger. Bread and butter issues are more important for large sections of the population. And if you want to build a mass appeal and you want to build a mass base for a left party, you need to go and talk about what people care most about, which is how to pay the energy bill at the end of the month, how to pay mortgage, how to pay their rent, how to feed their children, fundamental material issues that most people care about in a society, even though they might have different views on other things and different preferences, different lifestyles, maybe even different class locations. When a crisis comes, like the living cost crisis, it affects a majority of the population. And if the left wants to become strong and wants to fight for power, not just vociferate from the bench, but actually join the stage and try to fight and keep power, not just win some elections and then be ousted at the next elections, keep power and do something with it, you need to build a majority, you need to build a critical mass, and that means appealing to the things that most people care the most about, that are the most pressing issues in people's lives. And this is what a lot of mainstream lefts have done across the world, across Europe. But I think in the case of Italy, it's another indication of the lasting legacy of reformism, in the sense that the radical left reorganized itself in Italy after 1989 more quickly and more effectively than in other European countries, with the Rifondazione Comunista party that I'm sure you are aware of, which was a left split from the old Communist Party. You probably know very well that the majority of the All Communist Party decided to dissolve and create a new Social Democratic Party after 1989. But a significant minority in that party didn't want to do that. So they created a new party called Rifondazione Comunista, Communist Refoundation Party. And they were one of the most successful radical left parties in Europe in the late 90s, early 2000s. By building connections with the trade unions, with the social movements, the anti-globalization movement at the time was very strong. They built strong connections with that movement. In Genoa in 2001, the famous mass demonstration that was violently suppressed by the Italian state. But then they did very well in elections. And what did they do with that? They joined a social democratic government, a center-left government in coalition, led by Romano Prodi. And that was a government that implemented privatizations and austerity measures, so neoliberal measures, which meant that this party that had worked so hard to build its popular appeal and its credibility as a left alternative to the mainstream lost all that overnight, basically. It lost all that credibility. And this had a huge impact on the left in Italy and the relation between the left and the popular classes, which meant that Italy was one of the worst, although it was one of the worst affected countries by the Eurozone crisis in the 2010s. It didn't see the development of a strong left alternative like in Greece or Spain or Portugal. We know for other reasons those alternatives failed themselves. But in Italy, that didn't happen. It created a space for this kind of populist party, the Cinque Stelle, the Five-Star Movement, that had some left elements, but also some right-wing elements. It wasn't a clearly left-wing party. This party went into government. It didn't really do much to improve people's lives, which further opened the window of opportunity for the far-right populist parties, initially Lega and now Fratelli d'Italia, to come in and say that they have the right answers to people's problems. But we have the far-right in government. We have Meloni. She's been prime minister for around 3 years now, and not much has changed. And yeah, her party still wins elections at the regional and national level. But to put that into context, this party is winning elections against very low turnouts. In some cases, historically low turnout from voters. But also, it's a reminder what you mentioned, I would say the heroic strike of the dock workers in solidarity with the Palestinian people, and the mass movements and the mass demonstrations against the genocide in Italy. At some point, they had concomitant demonstrations in over 100 cities across the country. It shows that elections are not everything. Elections are not the only barometer in society for what people think, for how people position themselves politically. They may be the most important barometer, but not the only one. And I think these mass demonstrations and strikes and solidarity campaigns with Palestine shows that there is an appetite for struggle. There is an appetite for solidarity in Italian society that didn't go away, and that the new generations of activists are rediscovering it. And I hope that the new left will emerge from these movements and demonstrations and strikes. Because the old left, I think, has lost any credibility.
I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about this. Oh my gosh. I've had people freak out on the show over this issue, but hello. I've spent the last 13 years, less so in recent years because I've moved on towards other issues, but covering this very toxic debate that's gone on in British society from trans activists and feminists. It's been nasty at times, and I started to see how people who were critical of feminism were not incorrect when they said, well, this all kicked off with feminism, identity politics, because myself, I never regarded feminism as identity politics until I started to step away and see what they were talking about. And let me explain. It was Leo Sapir who came on the show and he made this assertion. He gave very good reason for this as well, but it goes back to the personal is the political. And that kicked off a lot in the 70s. I think it got its roots in the 60s, but it really didn't kick off until the 70s, and it started to fly in the 80s. It even merged into, in the United States, I can speak of that, self-help books, and then books that were sort of self-help quasi-feminism, like Women Who Love Men and Men Who Hate Them. And it became like this kind of ground for fomenting an identity based on oppression. Okay, fair enough, there is oppression in the world. There was a competitive oppression where, as you are probably aware, that many of the feminists who were more leftist and Marxist, they were eclipsed by a lot of the more bourgeois feminists who came in, didn't care about issues about class or race, and there was definitely racial imbalance and problems of representation throughout, especially given the United States history. The transgender lobby is taking over the rights of people who had heretofore worked for their kind of rights. Women to have their safe spaces in prisons and hospitals and bathrooms and pool locker changing areas, etc., etc., and for gay men and women to be able to date other gay men and women or whatnot, and not to be forced into this posture of having to defend themselves for not being transphobic because they are not interested in someone who is of the opposite sex. This is why this has been such a horrific issue for the left, because if you recall, right before he won office, Keir Starmer for many weeks was being asked to define what a woman is, and he could not do it, remember? And then finally he did it, but right before the election. I think it was like 48 hours before the election. And the reason why he did this is because women were leaving labor. I think that gender identity has been one of the biggest sore spots for the left, and they've been unable to unwind themselves from this mess that they helped to create. That's the problem. What are your thoughts on that? Because I think it's one thing to say, you know, these people are oppressed. Well, I think that the argument that they're even making about oppression has to be questioned, because their notion of oppression is if I say, I'm not going to call you she, I'm not going to call you a woman. Is that oppression?
Well, I think, again, this is not a debate that I'm super familiar with, and I don't have a very sophisticated position on this topic. But I think from the data that I've seen, trans people tend to have the highest or among the highest rates of violence directed against them, of mental health, kind of depression and anxiety levels, of self-harm and suicide levels. So as far as I can tell, they are at the bottom of the social pyramid in terms of their rights and the kind of dignity and respect that they are treated with by society. So from on that basis alone, I'm in support of trans rights, and I'm sympathetic with their struggle. But this is a broad position, and I don't have a more sophisticated position than that. At the same time, my wife tells me that she's never felt threatened by or insecure around trans women for her throughout her life, over 40 years of life. She felt like that from men, so not from trans women. So I can only speak from what I know. But at the same time, I think that the debate, from what I could feel from the outside of the debate, is very polarized. It's become very polarized and maybe sometimes artificially polarized in a way that prevents, on the left at least, it prevents any genuine good faith exchange of arguments and positions, which is not, it should not be the way we conduct debates on the left. I think on the left, debates should be used as a collective efforts to elevate our understanding of a certain political issue, to help us refine our position on a certain issue, not to score points. or to excommunicate people from the left, you know. And I'm not saying that one side or the other has done this more. I feel that from both sides in this debate, there is a polarized atmosphere and a toxic atmosphere that has prevented a genuine dialogue, you know, often. I'm not saying everybody is guilty of this kind of polarization, but I'm saying that some of the I agree that a lot of the ideas of liberalism, of individualism, have penetrated the left in the last few decades. And this is part of the broader historical process of the retreat of the left, a retreat from itself, a retreat from materialist class-based analysis and campaigning. And I think in many ways this has translated into an accommodation to neoliberal ideas on economic issues, but also an accommodation to liberal individualist ideas on some cultural issues, where everything becomes revolved around identity, around the ego. And I think that this comes with a lot of narcissism, and you know, the narcissism of the small difference, and moral posturing and moral vanity, and a kind of retreat from collectivism and egalitarianism, which are for me the hallmarks of being on the left.
I think also with what you were just saying about narcissism, I think there's on the left with the need to show what is called purity posturing as well, to show that I'm a good person, I think the right way. And I'm thinking, and that is tied into social media, as you well know. I think that that has distracted us from the work of collectivism. Because if we're going to talk about who suffers, I always tell people, why aren't we talking about disabled people? Why aren't we talking about obese people? Like, if we're really going to talk about suffering, surely the numbers are greater in these other categories. But this is a highly politicized category. I've done work on who funds a lot of this. George Soros, he actually spent an enormous amount of money to The Guardian to have this subject covered a few years ago. So I think that there's a lot of distractionism going on because it's very convenient to people in power that we argue about pronouns instead of housing, education, jobs, health, right? And these are the issues that unite us.
Yeah, I think this is what we should be focusing on, and I think there is time and space for more niche debates or more sectional debates on certain section of the population or certain specific rights for specific groups of people. I'm not saying these things don't matter and are not important. I mean, people's lives are at stake here now, and we should support equal rights for all people. But I think the focus and the center of our energies should be revolving around material issues, because these are the ones that unify us. Us being the 99% or the popular classes, whatever you want to call it, is the social majority against the tiny elite of billionaires and politicians who control society and control its resources and its political institutions. So what unites us against them is this material basis and material issues. And this is, I think, what the left needs to rediscover, and the class unity that can emerge from this convergence of material interests. Just to give an example here, I remember a debate among black socialists during the Black Lives Matter movement, and somebody was saying, "Oh, we don't need white people on the protests. We don't need their allies. They are part of the oppression. They are part of reproducing institutional racism and so on." And other black socialists were countering that by saying, we cannot solve the problem of institutional racism if we don't overcome its economic foundations, which are capitalist foundations. And we cannot overcome capitalism if we don't unite on a class basis. And these were the ideas of of Fred Hampton, now of Huey Newton, of Malcolm X in the latter stage of his political activism, that we need class bases, black, white, brown, whatever, to unite against the rich, because the rich unite with each other regardless of color, right? They don't care. The rich don't care if they are black, white, or brown, or whatever. They unite very easily on the basis of their common class interests. And yet we struggle to do the same. We struggle, one famous expression on the British left is that the class war or class struggle is something professed by the left, but practiced by the right. Because the rich, the ruling class, is much better at it, at organizing as a class and actually mobilizing in defense of its interests. So I think this is, just to finish on this, I think we need to rediscover class and class unity. And those on the left who undermine class unity, I think they often do it from a privileged class position, where they can afford the luxury of this narcissism of small difference. They can afford the luxury of dividing the working class, dividing the popular classes, because they don't need it. They are pretty safe. They have some academic job or some job in journalism or some kind of NGO, and they're pretty safe. But actually, the people who are actually struggling on low-paid jobs, precarious jobs, they can't afford that luxury. They need class unity because it's the only way in which they can improve their lives.
We had on the show recently one of the economists who was involved with the World Inequality Lab report that just came out, Ricardo Gomez Carrera, and we spoke about the fact that the top 10% own 3/4 of the global wealth. It's incredible that the bottom half holds only 2%. And then when you start to look at the distribution of wealth, it's more perverse. We just published a story yesterday on the global rise of billionaires through the recent Oxfam report, Resisting the Rule of the Rich. We've just surpassed 3,000 billionaires. And as you know, the other week, Elon Musk became the first man to have wealth exceeding $500 billion. He's worth more than many countries on the planet. And this is where my brain just freezes, and I think expropriation now.
Yeah.
And so then you've got politicians, of course, who say things like, Mamdani said this, that people should not be allowed to be so wealthy. Where do you draw the line? Who's willing to draw the line? Because I was talking to someone in California recently, and I was saying how here in Italy during lockdown, we had to continue paying rents. But the people who were landowners, homeowners, if they had a mortgage, that was frozen in time, right? And she replied to me and said, well, here in California, they actually froze rental payments. And so I was very interested in this because so many times I realized that even though the U.S. is on paper a capitalist country, there's oftentimes more socialist leanings in praxis in these kinds of moments. We'll call them state of emergencies. And so I'm really frustrated because we're seeing this kind of shift from exchange value to use value, with capitalism prioritizing production for a small exchange value. In order to break this logic, this would require us to reorient production towards use value, creating goods and services based on actual human and ecological needs. And I know you've been having a lot to say as an eco-socialist thinker on this subject. We have that in the same orbit as a rising working class, or what I call a new working class, because we've got loads of people who are hyper-educated, graduating with higher education degrees, even more than one or two, who are living a very hard life economically because there aren't the jobs that there once were. They are living in the gig economy. In fact, many of these white-collar workers are facing less job security than people working in factories, paradoxically. Yeah. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we definitely need to stop nitpicking on the left. What is the working class? who is exactly working class, who is petty bourgeoisie, and actually the far right is the one that does that. I'm just reading and reviewing a book now called How the Radical Right Changed Capitalism and Welfare by Philip Rathgeb, a political economist. And he shows that this is the socio-economic agenda of the far right today, at least on welfare, that only those working, what he calls market insiders, those who have worked for a number of years in the same industries, usually in manufacturing industries, they are the ones who deserve welfare in case they need it. Whereas the new working class that you mentioned, which is often predominantly female or sometimes immigrant based, precarious service based working class, is excluded from this entitlement to welfare. So the right operates with this dichotomy between the deserving old working class and the new unworthy working class. And interestingly enough, the left sometimes operates the same distinction, which it shouldn't, because in my definition, and it's a broad definition, but it's broad for a purpose, anybody who sells their labor force in order to pay the bills is working class. It doesn't matter the nature of your work, whether it's entirely manual or intellectual labor, or which is almost always the case, a combination of the two, whether you work on your own or you work in a factory of 10,000 people. Is if you need to sell your labor because otherwise you cannot meet the basic needs of your own reproduction, of you and your family, then you are working class. And in this category, we have the vast majority of the population. And I think this is an important, if you want, conceptual starting point, that we need this kind of unity at a conceptual, analytical level in order to build a political unity. If we separate people in different categories, the industrial working class or the new working class, or I understand why there is a need for these distinctions at a purely analytical level, but politically we can't build the kind of critical mass that I was mentioning earlier if we want to fight for power and conquer power. Now, on the question of the ecological transformation, again, to be perfectly honest with you, it's not a debate that I've familiarized myself with it very much. Again, I have a broad position on it, but I think that precisely for the sake of the working class, defined in this broad sense, not just the people who work in factories that produce fossil fuel, right? If we define the working class in this broad sense, then it's in the benefit of the working class to have healthier lives, less pollution in the air, better jobs in renewable energy and green infrastructure. I mean, the kind of green infrastructure that we need would create millions of jobs. And these jobs could be created on different terms than the current jobs. They could be well-paid jobs. They could be unionized jobs, So it would be the opportunity to recalibrate the balance of forces between capital and labor as well by creating these millions new jobs.
The report I referred to, the Oxfam report, doesn't actually mention precise data. It does give a certain year span, but a lot of the growth in wealth is directly linked to lockdown. There was an opportunity there for people who wanted to rein in power economically. I'm just thinking about the way in which you talked about public ownership earlier on, and I'm thinking of, is there a way that those of us on the left can move towards a core strategy where we could perhaps have the means of life as a guarantee: housing, energy, basic transport, food. This is something that I don't see coming out of the left, not here in Italy, because things are so fragmented. That, plus there's international war whack-a-mole. We could have protests every day about a new war that's being launched or abetted. the sale of arms to Israel by this country, Germany, pieces of arms, the UK, obviously the US. So, how is it that we're in this era where people are aware of the problems, but the ways to organizing seems to be so reduced? And I do wonder if the internet has a superficially empowering message, but in a way it works against us, because as long as we're online, we're not on the streets.
No, yeah, this is a very important question to consider, and I agree fully with what you said. We need to make the case for an economy that serves the needs of people and the planet and local communities and so on, not the maximization of profit for, like you said, an ever decreasing tiny elite of people. Every year, there's fewer and fewer of them that own how much money in the world today. Secondly, we need to recenter the debate around the working class and the power of the working class. Because again, with the strikes that you mentioned of the dock workers in Genoa, when the working class flexes its muscle, it can stop society. It stops the economy. It stops production. It stops supply chains. The working class has the power, the real power in society, but it has to activate it. It has to be aware of its power and to activate its power in support of change and transformation of society. And how we achieve that, I think we cannot escape the presence, the overwhelming presence, the omnipresence of the internet in our lives is a fact that we cannot escape. And I think we need to see. I don't have very clear ideas about this, but I think we need to find a way in which the internet can complement our organizing and activism on the streets and at the grassroots level in communities and neighborhoods and workplaces in a way that makes it easier for us to organize. So to be a facilitator of the actual grassroots work. And I think technology can be used for these purposes in a broader sense, right? A lot of the arguments of the last century against economic planning were based on the idea that we cannot communicate information about people's needs quickly enough and comprehensively enough in order to plan the economy accordingly, right? This was one of the main arguments in favor of the free market and against economic planning. But technology today would allow us to do that. Technology, instant communication that we have today, widely available, can allow for this kind of communication of information about the existing needs in society in a way that would make economic planning much easier and much more feasible and more effective than it was 80 years ago in the Soviet Union. So again, and I think just to mention briefly that, again, maybe on the left, we also need a revisiting of the experience of state socialism in the past century, in the Soviet Union and in other Eastern European countries. Because part of the retreat of the left that I mentioned earlier and the shift to the right also happened on this ideological level in how we relate to state socialism and the experience of those communist regimes, where a lot of the left internalized the right-wing mainstream anti-communist narratives about those regimes. And again, I'm not an uncritical supporter of those regimes. I was born in one, and there were many problems and many contradictions. But also those regimes achieved some incredible levels of social progress and social mobility. And
the home ownership rate in Slovenia is over 94%.
Yeah, same in Romania, exactly. So you had this, most of them were peasant societies stuck into late feudalism that in a matter of decades were brought into the 20th century by those regimes. With many problems, again, many limitations and weaknesses, but nevertheless, with some very clear gains in terms of human development and socio-economic progress. the literacy rate in some countries doubled in a matter of decades. What took Western countries to achieve in 100 years took these countries only a couple of decades to achieve in some respects. So this shows that even imperfect and flawed planned economies were able to deliver extremely impressive social gains. A country like Cuba, right? Again, I'm not saying the Cuban model is to be followed by every country, but a small country in the backyard of US, the American empire, sieged by embargo and sanctions for decades, still able to provide a decent life for most of its population, provide universal healthcare and education and housing to most of its population. Compare it to countries in its vicinity, like Jamaica or Haiti, even worse. Are those countries doing better than Cuba? I don't think so. And those are countries that, formally speaking, are capitalist countries, right? They follow the capitalist path to development, and look where they are today. So what I'm saying that we need to reappraise a bit the historical experience of actually existing socialism, as it was called sometimes in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, and see what worked, what didn't work, and maybe make the case again for economic planning, public ownership, not in a way to repeat those experiences, but to make it better than last time, because that's how progress works in history. You try time and time again until you achieve what you wanted.